The Hollow Crest. In a kingdom built on lies, the lowest heart holds the highest blood. This is the story of a woman who married into power, but found her true destiny in the arms of a man the world believed was a servant. This is the story of a love that could topple a throne, a secret that could reshape a kingdom, and a truth buried so deep that only the desperate would dare unearth it. This is the story of Ilara, the common-born Duchess who discovered that the man tending the falcons was the rightful king. And this is the story of how one moment of courage on a stone balcony changed everything. Welcome to High Seat Manor, where the walls whisper secrets and the gardens hide the ghost of a murdered dynasty. Welcome to a world where nobility is a costume and royalty wears rags. This is the Hollow Crest. The marble floors of High Seat Manor were always cold, even in summer. Ilara had learned this in her first week as the Duchess of Ravencrest, when she walked these halls in slippers too thin for nobility and pride, too fragile for scrutiny. 1 month had passed since her father, a wealthy merchant, had sold her into this life like premium silk, a transaction disguised as a marriage. The Duke, Cassian Ravencrest, had needed her father's trade routes and coin to maintain his crumbling estate. Her father had needed the title to elevate his name from the stink of commerce into the perfumed air of aristocracy. And Ilara, she had needed nothing but had been given everything she didn't want. Cassian was away at the capital, as he had been for most of their brief marriage. The servants whispered that he preferred the stone corridors of the king's court to the stone corridors of his own home. And Ilara couldn't blame him. High Seat Manor felt less like a residence and more like a mausoleum, a place where the dead weight of tradition pressed down on every surface until nothing living could breathe. She spent her mornings in the solar, embroidering things she would never wear, while a lady's maid whose name she could never remember sat silent in the corner. She spent her afternoons in the library, reading histories written by victors who rewrote defeats as strategic withdrawals and massacres as necessary evolutions. And she spent her evenings alone in her chambers, listening to the grandfather clock in the hall mark every second of her captivity. The servants treated her with the kind of polite contempt reserved for interlopers. They curtsied. Yes, your grace had her to death, but their eyes slid past her face like oil on water. She was common, she was purchased, she was temporary in their estimation, until Cassian tired of her father's money and found a proper wife of proper blood. It was loneliness that drove her to the gardens. Not the formal rose gardens at the front of the manor, which were maintained with military precision, every petal in formation, every stem standing at attention. No, Ilara found herself drawn to the rear gardens, the ones that had been allowed to grow wild, where the ivy strangled the statues and the paths disappeared under creeping moss. She discovered the falconry by accident, following the sound of bells, tiny silver bells that chimed with each movement of the birds. The building was stone, older than the manor itself, with narrow windows and a heavy wooden door that stood half open. She hesitated at the threshold. Ladies did not visit the servants' quarters, particularly not the working yards where men labored in shirt sleeves and sweat. But she was so desperately bored that propriety seemed a small price to pay for novelty. Inside, the light fell in dusty columns through the high windows. Hawks sat on perches, magnificent creatures with eyes like amber and feathers like layered steel. And standing among them, feeding a particularly large falcon from his gloved hand, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and shoulders that spoke of physical labor, not leisure. He wore simple clothes, a linen shirt open at the throat, dark breeches, leather boots scuffed and stained. But it was his bearing that struck her. The way he stood as though he owned the very air around him, as though the birds were his subjects and he their sovereign. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Most servants dropped their eyes immediately in the presence of nobility, a reflex trained into them from childhood. But this man held her gaze for 3 full heartbeats before inclining his head in a gesture that could have been respect or could have been mockery. She couldn't tell. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low and smooth, like honey over gravel. "I did not expect company." "Nor did I expect to find myself here," Ilara replied, surprised by her own boldness. "I was walking and heard the bells. The birds wear them so we can track them when they hunt." He gestured to the falcon on his arm. "This is Aurelia. She's learning to return on command." "Aurelia," Ilara repeated. "An old name." "From the old kingdom," the man said, "before the Ravencrests took the throne." There was something in the way he said it, a weight to the words that suggested layers of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She stepped closer, drawn by curiosity and something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. "You know the histories?" she asked. "Some of them," he said, "the ones they don't teach in the manor library." "And what would those be?" He smiled, a small, knowing smile that transformed his face from handsome to beautiful. "The true ones, Your Grace. The ones written by the defeated rather than the victors." Before she could respond, a bell rang from the manor house, a sharp, insistent sound that meant the midday meal was ready. The servants would notice if she was absent. The gossip would spread like fire through dry grass. The common Duchess wandering the grounds alone, visiting the servants, forgetting her place. "I should go," she said, but she didn't move. "As you wish, Your Grace," he said, turning back to the falcon as though she had already left. "What is your name?" she asked. "Julian," he said without looking at her. "I tend the birds in the gardens." "Julian," she repeated, and the name tasted like something forbidden. She walked back to the manor slowly, her mind full of amber-eyed hawks and a man who spoke of defeated histories. That night, she couldn't sleep. The grandfather clock ticked, the silk curtains rustled, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the lonely cry of a hunting bird. Ilara began visiting the falconry every day. At first, she told herself it was simple boredom, a need for conversation in a house where words were rationed like winter grain. But she knew, even then, that she was lying to herself. Julian was unlike anyone she had ever known. He moved through the world with a quiet confidence that needed no title to justify it. When he spoke, he chose his words with the precision of a poet and the economy of a soldier. And when he listened, which he did far more often than he spoke, he gave her his complete attention, as though her thoughts were treasures he was carefully collecting. They began with safe topics. The hawks, their training, their hunting patterns. The gardens, which plants were native and which had been imported by previous dukes with more ambition than sense. The weather, that eternal refuge of the conversationally cautious. But gradually, inevitably, they drifted toward more dangerous ground. "Tell me about the founding sovereigns," Ilara said one afternoon while they walked through the overgrown paths of the rear garden. "The books in the library mention them only briefly before moving on to the Ravencrest dynasty." "That's because the Ravencrests wrote the books," Julian said. "Or commissioned them, which amounts to the same thing." "So tell me what the books don't say." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the garden as though checking for listeners, though they were utterly alone. "The Aurelian dynasty ruled for 400 years, he finally said. "They built this kingdom from warring provinces, not through conquest, but through alliance. They created the trade routes that made the kingdom wealthy. They established the laws that made it just. They were beloved. And then? And then Cassian's great-great-grandfather decided he deserved the throne more than they did. He accused the Aurelian king of weakness, of trading with enemies, of secret pacts with foreign powers. All lies, but effective ones. He raised an army, laid siege to the old capital, and when the walls fell, He put every member of the royal family to the sword. Men, women, children. He erased the bloodline completely. Ilara felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. Completely? Julian's expression was unreadable. That's what the histories say. But you don't believe them. I believe what I've seen, Your Grace. And what I've seen is that truth is harder to kill than people think. They had reached the old chapel, a ruin at the far edge of the grounds, so overgrown with ivy that it looked like a green hill rather than a building. Julian pushed open the rotted wooden door, and they stepped into what had once been a place of worship. Now it was a sanctuary of a different kind, a place where ivy grew through the floor and birds nested in the rafters, and silence felt like a cathedral. I come here to think, Julian said. No one from the manor ever ventures this far. It's beautiful, Ilara said, and she meant it. There was something honest about the decay, about nature reclaiming what man had built, about the persistence of life, even in abandonment. They began leaving books for each other in the chapel, volumes of poetry and philosophy, histories written in languages the manor library didn't stock, treatises on governance and justice, and the rights of those who have none. Ilara would find a book waiting for her on the crumbling altar, and she would read it cover to cover before leaving another in its place. It became their secret language, a conversation without words, a connection that deepened with every exchanged text. And with every visit, Ilara felt herself changing, felt the woman she had been, the obedient daughter, the decorative wife, falling away like a shed skin, revealing someone underneath who was sharper, stronger, more alive. One day, she arrived at the falconry to find Julian kneeling beside a hawk that had injured its wing. The bird was in pain, snapping its beak at anyone who came close, but Julian spoke to it in low, soothing tones, and his hands gentle as he examined the damage. Can you help? Ilara asked. I need to set the bone, Julian said, but I'll need assistance. She's too strong for me to hold and treat at the same time. Ilara didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. Tell me what to do. He guided her hands to the bird's body, showed her how to hold it firmly but not cruelly, how to keep the talons away from both of them. His fingers brushed hers as he adjusted her grip, and the touch sent electricity up her arm, a sensation so intense it nearly made her gasp. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. The bird struggled between them, and the movement broke the spell. Julian quickly set the bone, wrapped the wing, and placed the hawk back on its perch. But when he stood and offered Ilara his hand to help her rise, she took it. And when their fingers intertwined, it felt less like assistance and more like a choice, a decision made by both of them simultaneously, a crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. Your Grace, Julian said, his voice rough. Ilara, she whispered. When we're alone, call me Ilara. I shouldn't. But you will. He smiled, that transformative smile that made her heart race. Yes, Ilara, I will. From that day forward, something shifted between them. The intellectual connection became something more, something physical and urgent and terrifying in its intensity. They didn't speak of it directly, didn't acknowledge what was happening, as though putting it into words would make it too real, too dangerous. But it was already both of those things. They began to steal moments, a touch of hands when exchanging books, a brush of shoulders when walking too close on narrow paths. Once, when a summer storm trapped them in the chapel, they sat side by side against the wall, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of him, leather and earth and something uniquely Julian. Tell me about yourself, she said. Not the histories you know or the birds you train. You. Where did you come from? How did you end up here? Julian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I came here as a child. I don't remember much before that. I was raised by the servants, trained in the gardens and the falconry. This is the only home I've ever known. No family? None that I know. That must be lonely. It was, Julian said, turning to look at her. Until recently. The way he looked at her, the intensity in his eyes, made her feel like she was being seen for the first time in her life. Truly seen. Not as a transaction, or a title, or a disappointment, but as Ilara, the woman beneath all the costumes. Julian, she breathed. Ilara, he replied. They leaned toward each other, drawn by gravity, or fate, or simple human need. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her want to weep. She closed her eyes, tilted her face toward his. And then thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the walls. They sprang apart, the moment shattered, reality crashing back down. Ilara stood, smoothing her skirts, trying to calm her racing heart. The rain is stopping, Julian said, his voice carefully neutral. You should return to the manor before you're missed. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She walked to the door, paused, looked back. Julian was standing in the center of the ruined chapel, haloed by afternoon light filtering through the holes in the roof, looking every inch the king he wasn't, and every inch the man she loved. Because she did love him. She could deny it to the world, but she couldn't deny it to herself anymore. She loved Julian, the falconer, the gardener, the servant. She loved him with a completeness that terrified her, because loving him meant destroying everything, her marriage, her position, possibly her life. But as she walked back through the rain-soaked gardens, she realized that she would rather be destroyed loving Julian than preserved loving no one. Cassian returned to High Seat Manor on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, 3 months after Ilara had first stumbled into the falconry. He arrived without warning, without announcement, his carriage rolling up the drive just as dawn broke over the eastern hills. Ilara was in the gardens when the servants rushed to tell her. She was supposed to be in the solar, doing needlework like a proper duchess. Instead, she was walking back from the chapel, a book of forbidden poetry tucked into her shawl, her hair slightly disheveled from Julian's fingers running through it. They hadn't kissed yet, though they'd come close a dozen times. They hadn't spoken words of love, though those words hung in the air between them like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. They had simply existed together in those stolen hours, and that existence had been enough. Until now. Ilara rushed to the manor, her heart pounding with guilt and fear. She reached her chambers just as Cassian entered from the hall. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, cold, handsome in the way a marble statue is handsome, beautiful but lifeless. His eyes swept over her, taking in her flushed face, her wind-blown hair, her muddy hem. You've been walking, he observed. The gardens, she said, cursing the tremor in her voice. I find them peaceful. Indeed. He crossed to the window, looked out at the grounds. I've been meaning to have the rear gardens cleared. They've become quite wild. The servants tell me you spend considerable time there. The servants gossip, Ilara said, with more courage than she felt. Servants always gossip, my dear. The question is whether they have anything worth gossiping about. He turned to face her, his expression mild, which somehow made it more threatening. I trust my absence has not been too burdensome? I've managed. Yes, Cassian said softly. I can see that you have. He left her then, but Ilara felt his suspicion like a physical weight. She tried to stay away from the gardens, from the falconry, from Julian. She tried to be the perfect duchess, embroidering in the solar, taking tea in the formal drawing room, making polite conversation with the ladies who visited, but Cassian watched her. She felt his eyes on her constantly, tracking her movements, noting her patterns. And when 3 days had passed without her visiting the rear gardens, his expression shifted from suspicious to certain. He had set a trap, and she had sprung it by avoiding it. On the fourth day, Cassian announced he was leaving for a hunt, a 3-day excursion to the northern woods. Ilara should have been relieved. Instead, she felt dread settling in her stomach like a stone. The morning he left, she watched from her window as the hunting party assembled in the courtyard. Cassian sat his horse like a statue, his back rigid, his face impassive. But just before he rode out, he looked up at her window. Their eyes met, and he smiled. That afternoon, unable to help herself, Ilara went to the falconry. Julian was there, training a young hawk. When he saw her, his face lit up with a joy so pure it broke her heart. "I thought you weren't coming anymore," he said. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted. They walked to the chapel, as they always did. Inside, me away from watching eyes, they finally allowed themselves to acknowledge what had been building between them for months. "Ilara," Julian said, taking her hands in his, "this is dangerous. If Cassian discovers us—" "I know," she interrupted, "but I cannot live without this. Without you. Even if it's only for stolen moments, even if it destroys me, I need this." "Then I am damned," Julian whispered, "because I need it too." He pulled her into his arms, and this time, there was no thunder to stop them. He kissed her, and it was like coming home to a place she'd never been, like discovering a country that existed only for the two of them. She kissed him back, with months of loneliness and longing, with all the words they hadn't said, and all the futures they couldn't have. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads touching. "I love you," Julian said. "I have no right to. I have nothing to offer you. But I love you." "I love you," Ilara replied. "And I don't care about rights or offerings or anything but this." They kissed again, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. Just this moment. Just this impossible love. Neither of them heard the chapel door open. Neither of them saw Cassian standing in the doorway, his hunting party behind him, his face a mask of cold rage. "How touching," Cassian said. They sprang apart. Ilara's blood turned to ice. Julian stepped in front of her instinctively, protectively, which only made Cassian's expression darker. "The servant protecting the Duchess," Cassian said. "How novel." "Cassian," Ilara began. Silence. His voice was quiet, controlled, which made it infinitely more terrifying than shouting would have been. He gestured to his men. "Arrest him." 2 guards grabbed Julian. He didn't struggle, though Ilara knew he could have. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on hers, trying to communicate something she couldn't understand through the panic flooding her brain. "Please," Ilara said, stepping toward Cassian. "I'll do anything. I'll leave. I'll disappear. Just don't hurt him." "How selfless," Cassian said. "But no. You see, my dear, you have humiliated me. You have cuckolded me with a servant in my own home, and that requires a response that everyone will remember." He turned to the guards. "Take him to the courtyard. Have the carpenter build a gallows. This traitor will hang at dawn." "No!" Ilara screamed, but guards seized her too. Cassian watched dispassionately as she struggled. "Take the Duchess to the North Tower," he said, "and make sure her window has a clear view of the courtyard. I want her to watch what happens to those who forget their place." They dragged them in opposite directions, Julian to the dungeons and Ilara to the tower. As they pulled them apart, Julian shouted something to her, but she couldn't hear it over her own screaming. In the North Tower, they locked her in a circular room with windows overlooking the courtyard. And there, she watched as carpenters built a scaffold, as guards dug a hole for the post, as the mechanism of execution took shape board by board. She screamed until her voice gave out. She beat on the door until her hands bled. She begged every servant who brought her food or water to help her. But they all avoided her eyes and said nothing. Night fell. Below, torches illuminated the gallows. The structure was complete. All that was missing was the man they would hang from it. Ilara collapsed against the window, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to Julian wherever he was. "I'm so sorry." Ilara didn't sleep. She couldn't. She sat by the window, watching the gallows, waiting for dawn and the death of the only man she had ever loved. Around midnight, she heard a key turning in the lock. She turned, expecting a guard, and instead saw an old woman slip into the room. She was tiny, bent with age, dressed in the simple black of a servant, but her eyes were sharp and bright, and they fixed on Ilara with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Who are you?" Ilara asked. "My name is Mina," the woman said in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "I was nursemaid to this house for 40 years. I tended Julian when he was brought here as a babe." "Julian?" Ilara breathed. "You know him?" "Better than you do, child. Better than anyone does. And I'm here to tell you a truth that will either save him or doom us all." Mina crossed to the window, looked down at the gallows, her face grim. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room unless you're certain you're willing to die for it. Because make no mistake, if you speak these words, there will be those who will kill to keep them silent." "Tell me," Ilara said. Mina took a breath, and when she spoke, her words changed everything. "Julian is not who you think he is. He's not a servant born to servitude. He's not some gardener's son raised in obscurity. Julian is the last living prince of the Aurelian dynasty. He is the rightful king of this entire kingdom." Ilara stared at her. "That's impossible. Cassian's ancestor killed the entire royal family. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what they were told," Mina corrected. "But the truth is different. The night the old capital fell, when Cassian's ancestor put the royal family to the sword, there was one child who survived. The youngest prince, barely 2 years old. His mother, the queen, gave him to me. I was her lady's maid. She begged me to save him, to hide him, to keep him alive until the time was right." "The time for what?" "For restoration, for justice, for the return of the true line." Mina's voice trembled with emotion. "I took the child and fled. I hid him in convents and monasteries, moving every few years to keep him safe. And when he was 10 years old, I brought him here to High Seat Manor, to hide him in plain sight, to raise him among his enemies until the people were ready to rise again." "Julian," Ilara whispered. "He's known all this time?" "He's known since he was old enough to understand. He's known that he is King Julian Aurelian, the true sovereign of this kingdom, living as a servant in the house of the usurper who stole his throne." Ilara's mind reeled. Every conversation they'd had, every book they'd exchanged, every word about the lost dynasty and the true histories. Julian had been speaking not as a scholar, but as the heir, as the living remnant of everything the Ravencrests had tried to destroy. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked. "Because knowing made you dangerous," Mina said bluntly. "Because if Cassian had any suspicion that Julian was more than a servant, he would have killed him years ago. The only reason Julian has survived this long is because the Ravencrests believe the Aurelian line is extinct. They think they won. That arrogance has kept Julian alive." "Until now," Ilara said, looking at the gallows. "Until now," Mina agreed. "Cassian doesn't know who Julian is. He thinks he's executing a servant who dishonored him. But tomorrow at dawn, he will murder the rightful king of this kingdom." "Then we have to tell someone," Ilara said urgently. "We have to reveal who he is. The people will revolt. The people will do nothing," Mina interrupted harshly. "The people don't remember the Aurelians anymore. It's been 100 years. They've been taught that the Ravencrests saved them from weak rulers. They've been fed lies for so long that the truth is a foreign language." "Then what do we do?" Ilara demanded. "Let him die?" "There is one thing," Mina said slowly. "One piece of proof that even the Ravencrests couldn't erase. a mark that every Aurelian sovereign bore, passed through blood from parent to child, impossible to fake. What mark? The sun scored, Mina said. A birthmark in the shape of a rising sun here. She touched her chest, over her heart. Every Aurelian king and queen bore it. It was considered a sign of divine right, proof of the bloodline's purity. Julian has this mark? He does. I've seen it myself. And there are still people in this kingdom, old people, scholars, priests, who would recognize it, who would know what it means. But Julian is locked in the dungeons, Ilara said desperately. How can we reveal his identity when no one can see him? Mina looked at her with eyes that had seen too much suffering and too little justice. That's why I came to you, child. Because tomorrow, when they bring him to the gallows, there will be one moment, one opportunity, before they put the hood over his head. And in that moment, someone needs to be brave enough to speak a name that hasn't been heard in this kingdom for a century. What name? Ilara whispered. His true name, the name his mother whispered to me before she died. The name inscribed in the old records that the Ravencrests thought they'd burned. Mina leaned close and spoke a name that tasted like rebellion on her tongue. Julian Aurelian Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Ilara closed her eyes. When she opened them, she knew what she had to do. If I speak this name, if I reveal who he is, Cassian will kill me. Most likely, Mina agreed. And if the people don't believe it, if they think I'm mad with grief and lying to save my lover, then you'll die for nothing, Mina said bluntly. But at least you'll die having told the truth in a kingdom built on lies. Ilara looked out the window at the gallows one more time. Then she turned to Mina and said, Tell me everything. Tell me every detail of the Aurelian line, every proof, every piece of evidence, because tomorrow I'm going to save my king. They talked through the night. Mina told her stories of the old dynasty, described the sun-scored mark in detail, explained the old laws and traditions that the Ravencrests had suppressed. And as dawn approached, Ilara felt something she hadn't felt since arriving at High Seat Manor. She felt purpose. Dawn broke cold and gray over High Seat Manor. From her tower window, Ilara watched as the courtyard filled with people. Servants, guards, a few local nobles who had been summoned to witness justice. Cassian stood on a raised platform, dressed in formal black, looking like an executioner already. Then they brought Julian out. He was shackled, hands bound behind his back, but he walked with his head high, his bearing regal despite the chains. He wore a simple white shirt that had been left open at the collar, and Ilara could see, even from this distance, the mark on his chest. A birthmark in the shape of a sun rising over a horizon, just as Mina had described. The guards led him up the steps of the gallows. The crowd murmured, some voices pitying, some vindictive, so all of them certain they were watching a servant die for the crime of forgetting his place. Cassian stepped forward to address the crowd. This man, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, has betrayed my hospitality. He has dishonored my house. He has seduced my wife and attempted to corrupt the natural order of our society. For these crimes, he will hang, and his body will be left on these grounds as a reminder to all who would forget their station. Ilara felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her hands shook as she gripped the window frame. This was the moment. If she was going to act, it had to be now. The executioner stepped forward, holding the hood that would go over Julian's head. Julian's eyes scanned the crowd, and then lifted, finding her window. Across the distance, their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw not fear, but acceptance, not regret, but love. He was ready to die for her, to protect her, to take the secret of his identity to the grave rather than put her in danger by revealing it. But Ilara wasn't going to let him. She threw open the window, the cold morning air rushing in. Every face in the courtyard turned upward to look at her. Stop! she screamed, her voice raw but carrying. "You cannot execute this man!" Cassian's face darkened with rage. "Silence her!" But Alara spoke faster, louder, before the guards could reach her. "You cannot execute him because he is not who you think he is. He is not a servant. He is not some common falconer." "The Duchess has lost her mind with grief," Cassian announced to the crowd. "Ignore her ravings." "I speak truth," Alara shouted. "And there are those here old enough to verify it. Look at his chest. Look at the mark he bears. The mark that every Aurelian sovereign carried. The mark that cannot be faked." A ripple went through the crowd. Some of the older servants craned their necks, trying to see. One of them, an ancient man who had served at high seat since before Cassian was born, pushed through the crowd and climbed the gallows steps. He looked at Julian's chest, and his face went white. "The sun scored," he breathed, loud enough for others to hear. "By all the old gods, it's the sun scored." More people crowded forward. Those old enough to remember the old symbols, those educated enough to recognize them, gasped and whispered. The words spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Aurelian, the mark, the lost prince." Cassian's composure cracked. "This is a trick, a deception." But Alara wasn't finished. "His name!" she cried, her voice breaking with emotion and desperation. "His true name, the name written in the old records, the name his mother spoke before she died, is Julian Aurelian Sol Invictus, the unconquered son, the rightful king of this kingdom." The crowd erupted. Some people dropped to their knees. Others shouted in confusion or anger or disbelief. Guards looked at each other, uncertain who to obey. And Julian, standing on the gallows with a noose around his neck and his true name echoing across the courtyard, finally allowed himself to stand at his full height, to meet the crowd's eyes not as a servant, but as a sovereign. Cassian drew his sword. "He dies now!" he screamed, starting toward Julian. But the old servant, who had first verified the mark, threw himself between them. "You will not murder your king!" he shouted. "Not while I still draw breath!" Other servants joined him, forming a barrier between Cassian and Julian. Then some of the guards joined them, then some of the nobles. Within moments, Cassian was standing alone on the platform, his sword in his hand, facing a crowd that had turned against him. "This is treason!" he bellowed. "No, Your Grace," said a voice from the crowd, old and dry and filled with righteous anger. It was Mina, stepping forward. "The only treason here is the treason your ancestor committed when he murdered the rightful king and stole the throne. This man is Julian Aurelian, and I was his mother's servant. I saved him as a babe and raised him in exile. And now, the exile is over." Cassian looked around desperately, but he was surrounded. The guards who had remained loyal to him were vastly outnumbered. He could fight, but he would lose. He could flee, but where would he go? He lowered his sword, his face a mask of rage and defeat. Julian spoke for the first time, his voice quiet, but carrying across the suddenly silent courtyard. "I claim no throne by force. I claim no crown by violence. But I claim my name. I claim my blood. And I claim the right to be recognized for who I am." He looked up at the tower window, at Alara, who was crying now, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. "And I claim the right to love whom I love," Julian continued, without shame, without hiding, without apology. The crowd roared its approval. Guards unlocked Julian's chains. They removed the noose. And as the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, lighting the courtyard with golden morning light, Julian Aurelian Sol Invictus, the unconquered son, the lost prince, the rightful king, walked free. 6 months later, Alara stood on the balcony of the old capital, which was being rebuilt from the ruins where it had burned a century before. The coronation had been 3 days ago, a ceremony that blended the old traditions Mina remembered with new hopes for a different kind of kingdom. Julian had been crowned king. Not King Julian of House Ravencrest, but King Julian of House Aurelian, first of his restored name. Cassian had been tried for the crimes of his ancestors and for his own crimes. He had been stripped of his titles and exiled, banished to live out his days in a monastery far from the capital, from power, from everything he had valued. And Ilara, the common-born merchant's daughter, who had become a duchess and helped restore a king, had been offered the title of queen. She had refused. "I don't need a crown to know who I am," she had told Julian. "I don't need a title to know what we are to each other." Julian had smiled that transformative smile she loved. "Then what do you need?" "Just you," she had said. "Just this." So she stood beside him now, not as his queen, but as his beloved, not wearing a crown, but wearing a simple circlet of silver. And as they looked out over the city, they were rebuilding together. Over a kingdom they were remaking from lies into truth. She felt something she had never felt in the cold halls of High Seat Manor. She felt home. Julian took her hand, their fingers intertwining as they had that first day in the falconry when they'd tended the wounded hawk together. "The lowest heart held the highest blood," Ilara murmured, remembering Mina's words from that terrible night in the tower. "And the hollow crown," Julian added, touching the circlet on his brow, "is filled at last." They stood together as the sun set over their kingdom, two people who had been told they were nothing but had proven they were everything. A servant who was a king. A duchess who was a liberator. A love that had toppled a dynasty and restored another. In a kingdom that had been built on lies, they had spoken truth, and that truth had set them both free. This was the Hollow Crest, the story of how one moment of courage on a stone balcony changed everything. The story of a woman who refused to let power destroy love. The story of a man who wore a crown in rags until the day he could claim it in light. And the story of how sometimes the greatest revolutions start not with armies or swords, but with a single voice crying out in the darkness, "This is wrong. This is unjust. This must change." And change it did.